Hello, this is a new topic for J277 that is additional to the old specification, and it's all about random number generation. So random numbers can be really useful for different purposes, and we're going to have a little look at that in this video. For example, you can simulate rolling a dice or picking lottery numbers as a simple example. So in gaming, random numbers are often used without you really realizing it. One example is for spawning your character into the game. So when you spawn into the game, you will have three different coordinates, usually an X, a Y, and a Z coordinate. So your X and Y is basically just your horizontal and your vertical position on the map. But your Z axis is like where you're going to be floating height-wise in the map as well. Usually this is going to be 0 so that you start on the floor and you don't float in midair. But those coordinates need to be random, otherwise people will know exactly where you're going to appear on the map. So let's look at some really simple examples here. So using pseudocode, we can use the word random, and that is acceptable on the examination that you're going to do. So you can use the word random, and then you specify the bottom and top values that you want to use for that random number. So in the exam, if you create a variable, call it number, and say that it's equal to random, and then the bottom and top value that you want to use. So in this particular case, we're using the word random. We're saying our bottom value is 1 and our top value is 10. So that will mean that the variable number, which is shown here, that will generate a number between 1 and 10, and it will assign it to the left, and it will assign it to that variable name. So in our program, we will have a randomly generated number. Let's, for example, say that it comes up with 7, and 7 will be applied to number, which means the value stored in this variable is 7. In Python, which you're going to use a lot during your course, so everybody should have programmed in Python at some point, you can use a ready-made library. So a library is something that we can import in, and it will have lots of ready-made functions that we can use. So in this particular case, we're going to import random, and then for our variable number, we are going to set that as using this particular function that already exists. So the first little bit of code, random, that specifies the library that we want to use during this particular piece of code. And as part of the random library, there is a function already in there called randint, and that generates a random integer. Now at this stage, we should know that an integer is a whole number. So it's going to generate a whole number using our bottom and top values. So it does the exact same thing as what we've said in pseudocode, but it's going to actually do the code for us because the library already exists. So let's just say this time we do it and it generates the number 5. 5 will be assigned to number. So another useful example where we could actually put this into place is for a dice roll. Now this was one of the previous tasks that we needed to complete. You did actually need to do a dice roll game. So if you are working on anything like that in your lessons or in your own personal time, this is an example of where you could use it. So for dice roll, again, we're going to look at the pseudocode example first. So in this particular case, we are setting a variable called dice roll. We've created this variable, and we're saying that we want it to be a random number, and this is our bottom and top value. So in this particular case, we're going to do it in Python. We've got our variable dice roll. We've used the function from the random library again, and we're going to say bottom value is 1, top value is 6. That is your standard dice, and when you roll it, it's going to generate a number between 1 and 6 and apply it to dice roll. Now, if you've got any experience of using functions at this stage, this will be very, very easy for you to understand. If you haven't actually looked at functions yet, then this is your first little insight of how it works. So with functions, the best thing about a function is that we can reuse them for efficiency. So we could use our little function that we're going to generate here. We can import it and use it again and again. That is exactly what we've just done with the library. Somebody else has already created a function and we are using it. So we can create our own dice roll function here. Obviously this is in Python as our example, but we've created our function. We've used this little word here, function, to create our function. We are then going to name our function, and I've named it dice roll for obvious reasons. The next bit is going to be our parameter. So it's up to you what you want your parameters to be in your function. You can actually leave it blank if you want to, but in this case, I want my parameter to be able to change. So in this particular case, my parameter is here, number of sides. Now, what you'll find in programming, if you haven't already realized at this point, is a lot of it is just like maths where we are doing substitution. So we've created this little parameter here that we can substitute a value into it. So inside this function, we've created our variable called number. We've done exactly the same as before using the random library, random integer. We've set our base value as 1 because we want to make sure that they can get the number 1 and nothing below that. But our max value is using our parameter. So it's like very, very similar to a variable, but it is only used as part of our function. So using number of sides, this is essentially going to be a variable that we give a value to. At the end of the function, we know it is a function because a value is returned. So when you see this word return, that is a big, big giveaway that this is a function. So whatever our variable's value is, this gets returned back to our main program so that we can use it for something. Okay, so when we actually call the function, that is the term used when we call the function of something. We are using it in our main program. So we're going to call the function and we're going to specify how many sides are on the dice using our parameter. So to call the function, we need to assign whatever our returned value is to this variable here. So I've created a variable called dice roll. It's probably not the most sensible thing to create a variable with the exact same name as our function, but for this purpose of explanation, I'm just going to do it. So dice roll equals, we're going to call our function and we're going to set the value of our parameter here. So when we talk about maths and substitution, when we call the function, we have designated this value 6 as our parameter. So when we talk about substitution, the 6 goes into our function here and replaces number of sides. So now it's function dice roll 6, number equals random.randint 1, comma, and this has been replaced with 6. So it does the exact same thing as our code before. Now our bottom value is 1, our top value is 6. It's going to generate that random number, so let's just say it comes up with 3. 3 gets substituted into our variable, and that value gets returned back to the main program. So when we call our function, that value 3 now goes into this variable here, and it is being substituted in. So at whatever point we want to use dice roll, the value that's stored in it is 3. If you are finding that a little bit hard to understand, when you do get up to watch the video on functions, it should make a little bit more sense. If you've already done this before, or if you've already programmed with it, then hopefully this is nice and clear. So we can also use numbers if we are quite clever. We can use numbers to help make selections. So the way that we do this is we're basically assigning numbers to items to select. So let's have a little look at an example. If we create our variable, this is a pseudocode example by the way, if we create our variable called number and we set it as a random number, either 0 or 1, so it's going to choose either 0 or 1, and once it has chosen that particular value, we're going to do a little bit of selection here. So straight away, as a little recap, the way to spot selection is to look for the word if or else or both. We know that this is part of a selection programming construct now. If our variable is equal to 0, then we're going to output heads. If it's equal to 1, then it's going to output tails. So we've used a numerical value to decide on an output. Another thing that is worth pointing out is that you can see that I've only really said if number equals 0, and I haven't mentioned the number 1. That's because there isn't any other value it can come up with. It can only either come up with 0 or 1. So if it's not 0, it has to be 1, which is why I've just put else. Some people like to do if and then elif and then else, but in this particular case, because we're using a fixed function, it can only come up with those two values. It couldn't come up with anything else. So therefore, this is the most efficient way of doing it. When we talked about selection, this is the if-else programming construct here. When we talk about substitution in maths, which is always applied using these variables, we can look at it as whatever value this function generates, so whether it's 0 or 1, let's just say it generates 1. That value gets assigned into this variable, so number is now 1. So then we're saying if number equals 0, which it doesn't, then it's going to go down to else and it's going to print out tails. Another way of doing it is combining some of our other programming tools that we've learned so far. So when we look at arrays or lists, we know that this is a way of storing lots of information in a data structure. So here in this little example, I've created a list in Python called player list, and it's only a one-dimensional list at this particular point, which means it's all in one section. That's the equivalent of just having one column of data. So in this particular example, I've put the numbers above, which obviously aren't shown in Python, but it's just to help you understand where things are. So Messi is stored in 0, Ronaldo is stored in 1, Mbappe is stored in 2, and Salah is stored in 3. These are the locations that the computer sees for the different items in the list. So then I'm creating a variable, and my variable is called player choice. Now I have used accessing the player list, but I've used my random function here. So exactly like we've used many times before, we're setting our low value and our high value. Now that is based on the start of the list and the end of the list, so 0 and 3. We've generated a random number, so let's just say it goes along and it selects the number 2 randomly. So this now in the brackets is the number 2. So player choice is equal to player list 2. So it goes to player list, it goes to the memory location 2. It gets this value, Mbappe, and it assigns it to the left to player choice. So Mbappe is now in player choice. Then when we print player choice, it will then output to the screen Mbappe. So that's a way that we have basically used the random integer function to select an array or list address, get the value that's in that, and output it to the screen. Really, really simple way of doing it. You can expand on this. You could swap it where Instead of it going to the number 3, it could just be the end, it could be the highest number in the list. And then as you keep adding items into player list, it will basically continue to work as well. So that is everything that you need to know for a random number generator. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. If you do need any more help, don't hesitate to get in touch.